Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So for today, we will be looking at a book called No Choice Theory, and this is by Ahmad Safavy, PhD, and it was published in 2017, so it's fairly recent, and it is an exploration of determinism. But before I get into the book, I want to just take a brief moment to talk about the podcast a little bit. You may have noticed that this is not the first episode number 5. I had originally uploaded an episode about a book called The Roots of Romanticism and had called that episode number 5, and I subsequently took that episode down, deleted it, and am putting this one up in its place. And the reason that I've done that is because I have been thinking about the progress by which I'm going through these books. And it's become apparent to me that I need to be a little more deliberate in the order in which I present them. I obviously can't just grab a book off the shelf and review it, because I'm trying to sort of tell a story or unfold some ideas of mine through these books. So they're not just random book reviews. There is a progression of ideas, book by book, that I'm working through. So it's important that I establish some fundamental ideas first before I go into other books with other ideas that advance those ideas. So The Roots of Romanticism talked about German response to the Enlightenment, but I hadn't actually presented anything about the Enlightenment by that point, and I thought, maybe I should do an episode about the Enlightenment first. And so then I thought, maybe there's some other things that I need to do before that, and we'll just let those episodes unfold. I'm not going to lay it all out for you right now of which book I'm going to do in what order, because, I might change my mind on some things, but I just decided I need to be a little bit more deliberate about the book selection process. And so I want to just do a real brief recap as well of what books we've done. So the first book that I reviewed was Liberty and Tyranny by Mark Levin. And in that book, I looked at some ideas of conservatism that I'm skeptical of, or that I disagree with. And then I did Encountering Naturalism, and I kind of did a similar thing. Thomas Clark presented some ideas in that book about naturalism and the implications thereof that I disagreed with. So I did that one. And then the third book was Day of Reckoning by Pat Buchanan. And that one, in contrast to Mark Levin's book, I presented some visions of conservatism that I'm more inclined to agree with, more of a paleo-conservative approach. And the points that he raises I agreed with a little bit more specifically. So now I feel like I'm kind of making a sort of a mental map here. Like here's some conservatism that I'm skeptical of. Here's some naturalism I'm skeptical of. Now here's some conservatism that I agree with. And so naturally the next stage in this progress is to present some view of naturalism that I'm more supportive of. And so that's where this book comes in. No Choice Theory is more of a hard determinism. And that is where I tend to fall. Now, I don't think it's necessary to agree with my position or to agree with the position of this author if you're interested in what I'm laying out as neofusionism. I don't think that there's like a bar you have to pass to say that I'm a hard hard determinist before any of the ideas I'm going to be laying out over the course of future episodes have validity. The reason that I am reading this and presenting this idea, because in some future episodes, probably in the next episode, we're going to get more into evolution. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to be drawing on are going to have some of their roots in evolution and evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. Because that's the element of naturalism that is pertinent to how we view ourselves, how we view human nature, how we view what is possible for a state or a people to do. So that's that exploration of evolution. It has to start with the notion that naturalistic processes have led us to where we are today, right? So it requires a rejection of creationism. It requires that if we say that man is created by God, versus if we say that man is created strictly through sequential evolutionary processes, completely causal, natural evolutionary processes, what we end up with as a vision of human nature is probably going to be a little different. I suppose it's possible that you could postulate that the human nature that we derive from evolution, you could postulate that exact same human nature is the human nature that was created by God. But I think that isn't going to provide an accurate avenue for speculation. Well, what if this circumstance happens or that circumstance happens? How and why would we respond in a particular way? If you approach it from an evolutionary perspective, your speculation about what is and isn't within the bounds of human nature, I believe, is going to be more accurate. And so that's the reason that I want to get into this, and that's kind of the way in which I'm binding these ideas of paleoconservatism and naturalism. They have to kind of fit together like puzzle pieces in order for this idea of mine to make any sense. And evolutionary theory is the method by which they are bound together. And so that's why I'm reviewing this book, and that's why we're going into this concept of determinism, because if we eliminate free will, which a strict determinism does, then the only remaining factors that guide human behavior are going to be measurable things like our genetics and our environment. With our nature and nurture, and with genetics and environmental factors, you can explain everything about people and why they do what they do. If you leave in free will, you cannot explain everything, because you leave people the possibility of going completely against the various things that have led them to where they are. And so I think that adhering to a naturalistic, deterministic, evolutionary perspective, not only in its accuracy, but also has a functional role to play in crafting a politics. So without any further ado, I present to you the new episode 5, No Choice Theory. So, like I said, this is a recent book, and he approaches determinism from a pretty strict sense, and he goes over a lot of science through the course of this book. Much of the scientific concepts presented, I'm not going to get into in this review. This isn't a review about the nitty-gritty of science. I mean, he presents it in a way that's very, very accessible to a layperson, which I am generally, but he also, he talks about atoms protons, neutrons, electrons, the orbitals of electrons, the process by which atoms are ionized, the process by which atoms bond together to form molecules. He starts the book with an explanation, or a quasi-explanation of the Big Bang. Obviously, there are components of the Big Bang that we still don't understand, but he presents those parts that we do understand, and actually we understand a fair amount of the Big Bang. And then from there, he step by step, sequentially, orderly, in an orderly way, unfolds the material world for us. So the creation of the first hydrogen atoms, the first helium atoms, the sequential creation of additional atoms through natural processes, the creation of molecules, the creation of proteins, the creation of DNA, the beginnings of life. He breaks down the DNA and the genetic code and the genetic process of replication, and he talks about living things and how their activity and their function is guided by their structure, which is an important point. You're just like a car does certain things and doesn't do other things because of its structure. Its structure allows it to function in a particular manner. An atom has a structure, and a molecule has a structure, and those atoms and molecules function in certain ways specifically as a result of their structures. Their structures are definitive. And as those structures become more and more complex, that principle by which their function is driven by their structures doesn't go away, it just becomes more complex. Just like the processes of DNA replication can be very complex. The process by which those DNA strands guide the creation of a living organism is an incredibly complex process, but that doesn't change the fact that the function and the process is driven by the structure of the DNA and the structure of the proteins and other molecules that interact with the DNA and the structure of the cells, etc., etc. And a lot of it is just beyond my knowledge base. But that doesn't mean that it's not all very orderly and structured. That's the synopsis of science, is that it all makes sense. In my first episode, I brought up the concept of logos, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And as a side note, the word logos is used in many places in many different ways. My understanding of it is according to that earliest presentation of the word logos in a philosophical setting from Heraclitus. I believe it's Heraclitus who introduced it basically as the binding force or principle that holds all of reality together. As we examine the world scientifically, it becomes apparent that structure, function, and causality primarily causality, is the binding force, that things are related to each other through the process of cause and effect, and the causes and the effects are structural and functional. And so that exploration of logos is what is going on in this book and in my review of this book. So as usual, I'm going to read a section to you toward the end, after he goes through this pretty involved explanation of the science behind his ideas. In the last few chapters, he starts kind of tying everything together, and that's the part that I want to focus on. He introduces a thought experiment that I think is pretty interesting, and I'm going to read to you what he has to say about this thought experiment, comment on it a little bit, and go from there. So without any further ado, he says, quote, "Let's close our eyes, just the physical ones, not those of our minds, and imagine a laboratory in which you could initiate a small bang, a laboratory-scale model of the Big Bang. You do this by pumping energy in the form of a pulse from a super powerful laser source into a super high vacuum reaction vessel in the form of a tunnel a few meters long. Every event that occurs in this tunnel would be visible to you, the experimenter. The commencement of the bang ignites a chain of events that would not stop until a red button at the end of the tunnel is pushed in. When depressed, the red button sends a signal to another laser source located in the ceiling of the tunnel, which in turn shoots out a hail of evaporating photons. The evaporating photons then inject such a high dose of kinetic energy into anything in its path that evaporates them into their initial creator light, or in other words, into a material annihilation. End quote. So I want to jump in here for a minute and just kind of remind the listener that this is a thought experiment. This is not a proposal for an actual experiment. This is not possible. It probably would never be possible to do this as he's describing it. It's a thought experiment, and that's all we can really view it as. All right. So he says, quote, "The events begin with the formation of very simple particles, which get more and more complicated in structure as the time goes on. The events also take place absolutely independent of the surroundings, that is, the tunnel walls and the rest of the physical experimental setup. They take place only in an events bubble, which is nothing more than the segment of space in which all events of the bang take place, a frame of reference. The bubble is also wirelessly connected to a computerized detector that senses the occurrence of every single event as well as its relationship to others. The totality of the events makes the bubble's environmental conditions. The bubble's environmental conditions at any given instance are a result of each previous event and develop as the experiment progresses. The operating computer is programmed to display each event as a dot on the monitor in a perspective fashion, with the small bang itself as a central dot. Each new dot would be connected to any other dot that played a role in the formation of the new ones, but any dot that has no effect on a following event would be deleted. A list of these deleted dots would be displayed in a column to the left side of the monitor screen. This would be the deleted column. The overall picture of the connected dots would be a perspective or 3D looking figure of a sphere at the end of the experiment. The computer generates these graphics through the following procedure. It saves in its memory a complete set of information on every single event that occurs in the bubble. For example, if there is a collision between two particles described below, this set of information would include the energy of collision, the nature of particles involved, the pre- and post-collision coordinates of the particles in the bubble, the coordinates of the collision itself, the post-collision remnant energies, if any, the nature of the product particles, if any, the direction of the movement of all particles after the collision. The computer then correlates each set of information with those acquired from the previous ones. These data acquisition processing functions of the computer would generate a virtual information sphere, which is simultaneously used to build the graphic representation. After an extremely short period of time from the start of the bang, during which you had no idea as to what kind of events might have taken place, you notice the formation of a number of tiny particles. The particles were produced as a direct result of the nature and properties inherent in the laser beam you used to initiate the small bang. As time goes on, you see that some of the initial tiny particles would start coming together to make even larger and structurally more complicated ones. This combination process is a function of one factor and one factor only: the properties of each combining particle and those of the ones that surround them, if any. These properties are built-in, unalterable, and inherent. Some initial particles, however, stay as they were, depending on the availability of others to combine with and the level of their energy. Regardless of their type and nature, though, all may become not only the starting material for the next generation, but also the very environment and condition for future events, playing a role in the development of the nature of anything and everything that would come later. The experiment keeps going on, eventfully but smoothly, and the particles keep getting more and more complex. One thing is certain, though. Combining or not, there is a constant and absolutely non-stop interaction of every single particle with others. That is why the computer-generated graphics on the monitor shows that every single dot is connected to the others, either directly, a first-order connection, or through other particles, a higher-order connection. This is a clear indication that in the events bubble, nothing is born independently and without a cause. Some of the increasingly larger things because they are now too large and too complex to be called particles, have started showing a branching pattern within their own particulate bodies, as well as a strange behavior. They are moving around using their own parts. They even move towards some other things, absorb them, and make them parts of their own. Another observation you make is the varieties in the ways these things behave. Something similar was also noticed at the beginning of the experiment. A group of particles, though only minutely different in their structure, behaved differently, and the difference in their behavior got more and more significant as they got more and more different in structure. But interestingly, all members of the same group, those with identical structures, did everything in exactly the same way. With things, the same pattern is expressed, although the number of the group members with the same behavior gets smaller as the degree of their complexity increases. Furthermore, the behavior of all things was a definite and direct consequence of the initial particles forming them as well as the sequence of their coming together. For example, if we use numbers to tag each different group of particles, we will have P1, P2, P3, etc. When these particles combine to form things, those made with the sequence P1, P2, P3 would behave differently than those with the P2, P3, P1 sequence. The experiment continues rolling until one of the things, now so well combined and advanced that could detect the infrared light coming from the red-colored end button. You were so impressed with this little thing that you decide to give it a name, and its being infrared sensitive makes the naming easy. You call it crimson. Although all other things in the same neighborhood are hit with that infrared, there is something about crimson that makes it susceptible to this wavelength. Upon a speedy review of the small bang's mechanism, you see no other reason for the infrared detecting ability of crimson than the properties and combination sequences of its constituting particles. And there is more about crimson that could make you proud of it. Right upon its infrared detection, it dashes towards the red button at such a speed that the force of impact pushes the button in and terminates the experiment. So, regardless of how far you intended to take it, your experiment is stopped, and all that is left from it are your own observations recorded in your memory cells and the 3D picture that the computer is showing you on its monitor. The screen shows the perspective image of thousands of tiny dots arranged in the shape of a sphere, with each dot connected to others by one or more straight lines. One of the dots sits exactly in the center of the sphere. This reminds you of a 3D picture of basketball with tiny millets filling its entire inner space and outer surface, with each grain of millet being tied to one or more of others by tightly stretched sewing threads. There are so many threads coming out of the central dot and its neighboring millets that it is hardly visible, but you know it is there because the whole ensemble is founded on it. Despite its very complicated appearance, the picture on the monitor screen is not too hard to interpret. Formation of every single particle or thing, including crimson, is connected to at least one previous and at least one next particle or thing. And as for the interactions, even if a given dot is connected to just one dot, the latter one could be connected to several, and those several to other several, and so forth, and as such, the overall pattern would be that of a very tightly knit spiderweb pattern, with the central point being the beginning event. One other point of note is your observation that the deleted column to the left of the screen is completely empty. This further confirms that no event was detected which did not play a role in the development of future events. The small bang thought experiment draws an imaginary picture, of course, but imagination, especially when it could be extrapolated to the real world, may serve as a guiding light to show the way to a non-imaginary conclusion. The small bang thought experiment attempts in drawing a simplified picture of events' connectivity during and after what we now know as the Big Bang. Just like in this experiment, there is no reason that the original singularity state of the Big One could not be extended to the present and then into the future. In other words, that spiderweb pattern revealed at the end of the small bang experiment might be a valid model for the connectedness and the cause and effect mechanism of the universal events. What could be the reason for not believing in a model of the world in which every event is connected to the ones in its past and to those in its future by threads of information? From whatever knowledge available as of today, I cannot help but believe in some kind of information which had been encrypted in the very essence of the Big Bang's energy at the singularity stage. The info could have propagated outward from within the singularity, not only to determine but to become the nature of every single event that occurred afterwards. And to clarify what I mean by nature of events, let me use an example. This example focuses on only a tiny time point in the 13.7 billion years of the universe's history, but may be generalized to all points of that time window. An atom of the element sodium was produced by some type of thermonuclear reaction at the core of a star. The information transferred from the parent atoms, those that were converted to sodium in the thermonuclear reaction, to sodium, determined an arrangement of electrons around the nuclei which was uniquely specific to sodium. This arrangement makes the resulting atom nothing but sodium. In fact, it may be considered analogous to the transfer of genetic information from parent to offspring in the Animalia and Plantae kingdoms. Encrypted in the certain arrangement of sodium electrons is a message, a piece of information that encodes, for example, for the violent reaction of sodium with water. In other words, the violent reactivity with water is a nature of sodium. Therefore, the information or message that was inherited by sodium from its parent atoms also becomes its nature. By the same token, applying this information mechanism to the small bang's spiderweb model, we could readily see that the connecting arms of the web would be in fact nothing but information that connects any and all dots or events together. Now here comes that question again. Why could this model not be applied to the Big Bang? I believe the answer is it could. And the reason is what I would call the energy-information duality principle, the mutual encryption of energy and information. Energy is information, and information is energy. Consider this. What is the nature of an electronic message, such as a phone text or an email? It's electromagnetic radiation flying out of your device to the other side. What's electromagnetic radiation? It's pure energy in the form of photons. Your friend's device picks up those photons and translates them into words. Is it not logical to conclude that the electromagnetic radiation photons contained your message, which was really some type of information, within themselves in the form of frequencies and wavelengths, which were all uniquely special to every word and the overall format of your message? After all, it was those photons of energy and nothing else that carried that information over to your friend. If the initial energy of the bang has been able to so powerfully fuel the formation and operation of our universe, and by universe I mean all matter plus all events, for the past 13.7 billion years, it must have also been able to transfer its information particle to particle, thing to thing, and therefore event to event. This transfer of information could not have occurred had it not been for the fact that some initial message was originally encrypted in the bang's energy. And that could mean only one thing. Energy is also information, and information is also energy, or the energy-information duality phenomenon. End quote. Okay, so that is his thought experiment there and some commentary on it. I feel, as a reader and an observer of this thought experiment, that it's a good one, and it's got some flaws. It's a good thought experiment, and the purpose of the thought experiment, I think, is to say, okay, look, you can't really get outside of the universe to look in. We can only experience the universe from within. But if we could hypothesize a miniature universe, a miniature Big Bang creating a miniature universe, and we could somehow observe it from outside, we would see that everything that occurs within this miniature universe has unfolded from some previous event within this miniature universe, right? Everything within it's self-contained. The point here is that it's self-contained, so that your observation of this universe doesn't actually influence it in any way. It's its own thing. It's created through some hypothetical laser mechanism, but it's its own thing, and you can observe it. And so, as an outside observer, you can see that everything within this micro universe is connected to itself, results from itself, and is perfectly causally structured. That's, I think, the purpose of this thought experiment, and it lets us kind of look and say, okay, well, if hypothetically we were looking at the universe from the outside and we were disconnected from it, what we would see would be this strict causality. I think that he's got a few problems with his thought experiment that he could very easily have avoided. The first one being that he states that, well, in the very first few moments of your little hypothetical miniature universe, you don't really know what happens. He says that in there somewhere. I don't recall the exact words, but he basically says that in the very first moment of your little experiment, you can't tell what's going on. But after that, you can record all. And okay, well, there he kind of puts a hole in it right there, and he does that because in our understanding of the Big Bang, in the very, very, very first fraction, minuscule fraction of a second, like a decimal point with 40 some odd zeros after it, seconds, we don't exactly know what happened. Our modern era 2019 scientists don't exactly know what happened in that very first sliver of the Big Bang. And so then he carries that lack of information over to this thought experiment, which I think is a mistake because it puts a hole in it that somebody could say, well, in that very first moment, something spooky happened, something supernatural happened. I think that the premise here is that this is a perfectly observable microscopic universe designed to illustrate causality. And our current ignorance about things that are very remote from us shouldn't necessarily be translated into this thought experiment. Because just because we don't necessarily know exactly what happened at that moment in time doesn't mean that we can extrapolate that the causality which thoroughly occupies and fills every bit of our understood knowledge about the universe, that in those areas that we don't really understand, we're going to insert some other kind of non-causal thing. It's not that it's non-causal, it's that we just don't understand it at this point in time. I mean, it's the very first fraction of a moment after the Big Bang. I think we can be forgiven for not entirely understanding it. That's not an excuse to insert some kind of non-causal phenomenon in that sliver. And so carrying that mystery from our scientific understanding into his thought experiment, I think that's a mistake. The second mistake I think he makes in his thought experiment is this whole concept of the crimson thing. I think what he's trying to illustrate is that crimson exhibits some sort of consciousness, capacity to see, to perceive beyond the bounds of the universe through conscious awareness or something. Which is all fine and good, but if crimson is able to perceive this infrared light coming from the button that causes the end of the experiment, then that experiment is no longer self-contained. There's infrared light coming from the button into the small bang model, right? I mean, the whole point is that it's isolated and self-contained. So it has a cause. This small bang universe has a cause outside of itself coming from that button. The button's not part of the small bang, and yet it's influencing components within the small bang. And there's no reason for that to happen in this thought experiment. It breaks the thought experiment down. It breaks the self-contained nature of the thought experiment down to say, well, what about the infrared light? That it's not really all causal because some sort of force outside the universe has influenced something in the universe. There's no reason to violate your own thought experiment that way. So I think that's a mistake. The overall point, though, I think is valid that he's trying to make, which is that this thing is completely self-contained and completely causal, and there's no reason that you can't extrapolate that to our universe. And it unfolds, the small bang unfolds in a very determined, specific way based on the qualities and structures of the things which exist at one moment. The next moment is an extrapolation of that information to the next event or the next set of events. So, there's my commentary on that. Then, let's see. He goes to a little bit more detail here, or not detail, but I guess he draws a conclusion that kind of sees a big picture of the point that he's trying to make. And so that's something else that I want to read to you. He says, quote, "So, after all that has been discussed so far, what would be the take-home conclusion of this book? Or, as we may call it, the final product of our synthesis? By now, I am sure you have at least an abstract idea about it, but let's try to put everything in a final order, as order enhances our abilities for better understanding, analyzing, evaluating, and decision-making about any issue. We started out from the Big Bang Theory, the theory of the birth of our universe. Naturally, as everything that followed was based on this one theory, its validity should have been of fundamental importance. Fortunately, the Big Bang Theory enjoys solid support through more than one scientific evidence, which were listed in Chapter 2. The causal deterministic theory, or the no-choice theory in this book, has its base in the Big Bang Theory by proposing that, 1. All post-Big Bang events are part of a single and continuous flow of interconnected information transfer processes, which will run into the future and through the lifetime of our universe. 2. The single glue that sustains universal events' interconnectivity is the phenomenon of causality. 3. Causality is the essential driving force for the occurrence of any and all events, and is the reflection of the information acquired from an immediate previous event onto a future event. 4. Causality also initiated the formation of matter as the reflection of the transferred information encrypted in the singularity energy. 5. The nature of atoms comprising matter is dictated by their nuclear and electronic configurations, which themselves are the reflections of their causality. 6. The nature and number of particles comprising matter are at the same time both an effect of the last and the cause for the next event. 7. The nature and number of particles comprising matter, along with their spatial coordinates, form the environment, which is in part the cause for future events. 8. The nature and number of particles comprising matter also determine the mechanism of energy exchange processes. 9. Energy exchange processes are responsible for inter-system exchanges of information due to the principle of energy-information duality. 10. The resultant overall effects of propositions 1 through 9 have led to a deterministic universe. The preceding propositions suggest that the path of evolution of the universe was determined according to the essential information of the original energy of the Big Bang. It was this information, or code, that led to the formation of particulate matter. From there, everything proceeded according to the properties of every single particle of matter, and their interactions within infinitesimally small but continuous segments of time. This chain reaction gradually led to the formation of increasingly more complicated systems, each undergoing a cause and effect process. The elements of the periodic table were formed, one by one, with each one determined only by the properties of its parent particles and the energy-information duality of its environment. Even the energetic aspects of their synthesis and the corresponding environmental conditions were results of the surrounding matter. As such, elements, or atoms, each with its specific chemical properties and specific locations or coordinates, came to existence in the universal space. Both the chemical properties and the spatial coordinates of each generation of particles were determined by those of their parent atoms, and the produced particles themselves determined those of the coming generations. The continuous interactions of particles formed more and more complicated and larger ones that we now know as molecules. Just like the simpler and smaller beginning atoms, the properties of these molecules have been a direct result of their specific structures. The way the constituting atoms have come together and have been arranged in a molecule determines the chemical, physical, and mechanical properties of that molecule. And again, the nature and spatial coordinates of those constituting atoms are the only factors that determine what kind of product molecules would be made. All the information that is needed to guide a process to the next step is coded within all components of this universe, be it matter or energy. As for the larger combinations of the more advanced molecules, those classified as the Animalia and Plantae kingdoms, they are also the exact functions of their structures. They are machines in which movements of their parts are determined by how the atoms and molecules of their genetic systems had been bonded together. The codes encrypted in their genome determine the structure of their whole system. In animals, their whole system also includes their brains that command and control all their mental and physical activities. How to move, how to eat, how to grow, how to react and respond to the stimuli from their environment, which includes other large combinations of atoms and molecules that do the same things. And the nature and pattern of arrangement of the atoms and molecules that shape brains also tell the holders of those brains how to think. That is, how they think is determined by their structures, and those structures are nothing but the kind, number, and arrangement of their atoms. In plants, although brain as a defined structure does not exist, living mechanisms are based on the same structure-function principles. In addition to the individual structural factors and variables, the fate of things is determined by their interactions with their environment also. The environment affects things according to its own properties, which arise from its own contents due to the action-reaction principle. In the case of animals and plants, the information from any environmental effect is processed in their brains, or any organ that is developed to process information. In other words, whatever changes that is made as a result of interactions between any entities and their surroundings is determined by the type, properties, number, and arrangements of the atoms involved from all interacting participants. And since the atoms involved and their arrangements are fixed entities, that is, have a given structure at any given point in time, these changes are causatively determined. So there it is, our deterministic picture. The Big Bang's initial energy, containing the initiating information, or instructions, brought about another form of energy that we call matter. Then, matter behaved according to the instructions encoded in it. Within the course of this chain reaction, matter also generated energy. For example, a star core gravity generated heat that created other forms of matter in the form of chemical elements, which eventually led to the development of things we call plants and animals. Every newly formed thing, from atoms to molecules, to rocks, birds, trees, us, etc., was developed according to the instructions or information contained in the atoms of both its immediate predecessors or parents and in those of the environment they were formed within. No thing has been or will be independent of other things, and it is this collective and structure information-based interaction among things that determines events and makes the world deterministic. Or, in other words, fixed structure creates fixed fate. I should emphasize that in the context of this discussion, structure refers to the structures of all components of the universe taken into account simultaneously and within each given section of time. The degrees of interaction among these components to lead to any event, however, varies and is determined by their spatial coordinates. In the development of causally determined events, no structure is to be considered completely isolated from others. Based on what I have shared with you so far, it is my belief that the functioning model of our world is an interactive spiderweb model, and no matter how much this universe has grown, or will grow, in both size and complexity, the overall interconnections and interactions among its constituting elements have been and will be a continuous flow phenomenon which we may justly call causality. And as long as a system, such as the cosmos, works through the causality mechanism, that system is deterministic. And in our deterministic world, there can be no choices and no custom-made selections which could be made according to our free will. Free will is an illusion, created because we only think we make our choices freely. In the case of us humans, our Homo sapiens pride keeps our mind in the free will box, which, by the way, has thick and sometimes impermeable walls. In reality, though, our decisions, choices, and selections are made according to two variables: our individual structures and those of the components of the rest of the world, that is, our environment. Events that shape this world are strictly structure-based, and things have no choice but to follow the functional outcomes of those structures. The cell phone that you are using, probably every day, even if it's a smart one, cannot fly, at least not just yet, because it's not designed to fly. It does only what it's been designed to do. And it does only what its structure is capable of doing. The same is true of everything else in this world, including our bodies and our brains. Our brains make our choices and decisions according to their structure and the very fine details of those structures. And those structures have their roots in events and processes dating back billions of years ago. We may think of our minds, psyches, and spirits as entities with supernatural powers and abilities, but at the end of the day, all of those powers and abilities originate from and are created in a material 3D structure called the central nervous system, and according to their interactions with another material and 3D structure called the environment, which, by the way, is both internal and external. It would be only a very short-sighted view to isolate our brains and everything else in the world from other things, events, and processes that, like the protein chains of a spiderweb, have been interconnected from the very beginning of creation up to the moment of our making a decision. It may not be the most pleasant of conclusions, but we, just like that cell phone, are functions of our structures, which themselves are the results of their predecessors' designs, and those designs were surely the will-less resultants of the number, the nature, and the arrangement of their parent atoms and those of their environments all the way back to the Bang. There is no isolated, independent, self-controlled, and therefore free will being anywhere in this universe. If there is a thing, it has to be at least informationally connected to other things, and every ensuing event would be the result of those connections. Like it or not, we, and we in this case means everything and everyone that our five senses could detect, are all connected, both existentially and functionally, to one another and to the very origin of our universe. Everything and everyone is the effect of its previous cause, and determinism is the rule of the game. End quote. So yeah, he repeats himself a little bit there, but it's a pretty good, straightforward explanation and assertion of the absolute determinism of the universe, and the interesting notions that he put forward about the energy information duality. How any form of energy contains, and I would postulate that this includes matter, itself contains information that is sort of a blueprint for what happens in the future. Like he talks about the sodium atom has information encoded within its structure that makes it reactant with water, so that even if a sodium atom has never encountered a water molecule, it can be read to understand how it will react with that water based on its structure and the structure of the environment, aka the structure of the water molecule. Knowing the laws of physics intimately and knowing the structure of sodium and knowing the structure of water, you can infer what will happen when they interact with each other, so that all of the information about the entirety of the spiderweb is encoded within the information of the existing matter and energy at any particular point, all the way back to the Big Bang. So there's that. I think that's pretty solid. Now, I'm going to jump to a bit earlier section when he talks about chaos theory, because you have to kind of understand that we don't have perfect information about the world. And so this information that's encoded in reality that tells us what's going to happen next and what has happened in the past is outside the bounds of our capacity to perceive. We can get bits and pieces of that information, but we can't ever get all of it. And so you kind of have three different spheres of information. You have reality and all of the information encoded within it. And that is absolute, and it is 100% accurate. Like, if the information encoded within reality is a perfectly accurate information about reality, right? It is its own thing. But then a step removed from that, you have humans' scientific understanding, which seems to be accurate, and we might say is partly accurate and is getting more accurate, but never is completely accurate, because the complexity of the universe is so all-encompassing and so deeply complex and overwhelmingly complex that all we will ever really be able to acquire are approximations of it. They might seem like accurate, but they're approximations. And then you have the sphere of human understanding in a day-to-day manner, which is one step removed from scientific understanding, right? Like, science can understand that we have atoms, but in a day-to-day human experience, you don't see atoms. You might see the result of atomic processes, and you might be told for scientific information about those processes. But there's a lot that our day-to-day experience doesn't reveal to us. Only is revealed through careful study and experimentation. And so human understanding is never perfectly accurate. All right? So he talks about chaos theory and what appears to us to be chaos. Like in the first episode, I talked about another principle that I called ananke, because I like to draw on these Greek words. It's a thing of mine, which is basically the premise that, as I just said, we don't have perfect information, and so there exists for us, and there always will, since we do not have perfect information, there exists for us an element of mystery in the world and an element of chaos in the world experientially. When I roll a dice or I shuffle a deck of cards and I draw a card, it seems random. But it's not. It's a mystery to me what card I will draw next. But it's not a mystery to reality. Reality has put a card there through a specific shuffling process based on the condition of the cards prior to shuffling, based on the process of shuffling, etc. There's no randomness in the deck of cards that has been shuffled. It's only random to me. It only seems random and it seems chaotic. It's not. So, with that stated, I want to get into what he has to say about chaos theory. He says, quote, "Successful weather prediction has always been the holy grail of meteorologists. This is because the weather plays some role in almost whatever we do, and it gets increasingly more important when it comes to large-scale activities such as sports, commerce, military, travel, shipments, etc. So when the newer generation of electronic computers started to emerge during the 1950s, meteorologists were among happy campers because, as we may already know, weather predictions, especially for periods of more than a few days, always proved to be very inaccurate or mixed at the best. That's why Ed Lorenz had decided to use his expertise in mathematics to develop improved weather models for more accurate predictions. As a part of this process, he decided to test his models on a newly delivered computer at MIT by feeding it several months' worth of modeling data. The models were deterministic differential equations of the same types used in Newton's laws of motion. Betting on the accuracy and efficiency of his computer and the deterministic nature of the equations, he hoped to get nothing but consistent and reproducible results, and as such it should not be to anyone's surprise that he was both shocked and disappointed when what his computer spat out at him was far from his expectation. Instead of getting the same reproducible weather model, each time he plugged in the same initial numbers, out came a different one. As a savvy researcher, he double-checked everything, including the sanity of his computers, and rerunning the program several times. Everything checked. At a point in time when a sharp, meticulous, and objective mind separates itself from a not-so-much one, Lorenz decided to look at his numbers, and there he got his answer. To save time, he had rounded off the numbers that originally contained 6 decimal places to numbers with 3 decimal places, while the computer was still calculating based on 6 decimal places. For example, my example, not his, 1.023123 was rounded off to 1.023, as the contribution of the remaining 0.000123 was not expected to be of significance. This is both an allowed and a usual practice in science, and that's why the seasoned mathematician did it, and that's why he was sort of irritated when he got the off results. So if a seemingly insignificant change in the starting numbers could produce significant changes in the outcome of the experiments, weather models in his case, then Ed Lorenz had arrived at and proved right what Henri Poincaré had proposed about 3/4 of a century earlier: the hypersensitivity of some systems to their initial conditions. So if we could call Poincaré the granddaddy of chaos, then we could definitely call Lorenz the father of chaos theory. Now let's see what I mean by some systems in the last paragraph, and what the chaos theory itself is anyway. By some systems, I mean what is known in physics as dynamical systems. Simply put, dynamical systems are those that change over time and that are sensitive to their initial conditions. The movement of ocean water, fluctuations of the stock market, patterns of traffic jams, movement of billiard balls on a pool table, and of course the weather, are examples of dynamical systems. It is in these systems that prediction of a future event, by using its initial condition data and having the right formula, could be possible. But let me add also that could be is definitely not the same as will be. This is beautifully done in the case of the 2 body movements in the solar system and by the use of Newton's laws of motion, his gravitational attraction rules, and the differential equations he and Leibniz developed. This technique, though, would not work for 3 or more body systems, as described above. Now, what about the chaos theory and what it says? First, just remember that this theory holds only in dynamical systems. For a system to get chaotic, it has to be a dynamical one first. Simply stated, the theory is a proposition on the behavior of dynamical systems. The change in a dynamical system at any future time, t, is highly sensitive to even minute variations in its initial conditions at time 0, and cannot be precisely predicted due to the lack of perfect precision in the initial conditions measurements. Also, the precision of any prediction at time t is inversely proportional to the time difference, t minus time 0, meaning the longer the t minus time 0, the lower the precision. What I have talked about so far in this chapter may now lead to this question. If deterministic differential equations are used to calculate the outcome of a dynamical event, and when we feed the equations with real data, why should we come out with chaotic results? The answer is in our inability to reproducibly make 100% accurate measurements, the data, and the inability of our processors, such as computers, to reproducibly process those data. The argument of chaos is due to the lack of our ability to precisely predict the future. But the world does not care whether or not we can predict the future. It does its own work and goes through one and only one channel, the causally determined channel. In fact, Ed Lorenz himself once wrote, "Chaos, when the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not approximately determine the future." To me, the first part of this statement clearly confirms the deterministic nature of the universe by confirming the validity of the cause and effect principle. The second part, however, is irrelevant, because in actuality there is no such thing as approximate present. The present is either 0 or 1. What Lorenz must have meant was that our inability in making 100% accurate and reproducible measurements makes the present approximate. In other words, what Lorenz calls approximate is in fact our approximate knowledge of the present, due to the fact that our measurements and the function of our calculating instruments are approximate, and as such are not and could not be 100% accurate. Otherwise, the present has only one single facet, and that's what actually happens, and therefore is. The future is always precisely determined, we just can't know it. End quote. So there you have it. The principle of chaos theory is essentially a result of the fact that things are incredibly complex. Reality is incredibly complex. These dynamical systems are very complex, and we can't possibly have information that is so precise that we can perfectly predict the future of these systems. Now, as time goes by, our measurements will presumably become more and more accurate as technology is advanced. But there will always be a degree to which we are incapable of acquiring perfect information and therefore being able to have perfect predictions of the future. In that sense, we can't see the future. That doesn't mean that the future is not very strictly predictable by some hypothetical entity that did have perfect information and a perfect understanding of the laws of reality and perfect processing power. It's just that humans are not that hypothetical individual, and we never will be. It's outside the bounds of our capacity as entities that are inherently limited to ever have absolutely perfect information. Now, the other topic that he raises, I'm not going to go into in much detail when he talks about quantum theory and quantum theory's postulates that at the tiniest and most fundamental levels of reality, in the realm of subatomic particles, true chaos and true randomness return. He disputes this with something called the pilot wave theory, that is a theory that has not been completely disproven, but has not been adequately supported either. I would just say this about quantum theory, because I don't want to get into it in much detail. Just this, that there are a few areas in reality, one of them being the very, very beginning moments of our world, in what's called Planck time, after the Big Bang, when we don't exactly understand what happened. Incredibly complex dynamical systems where we are incapable of measuring, and quantum theory, where we don't exactly understand what's going on and why. Those areas that we don't have complete understanding or knowledge or information about, they tend to seem maybe like chaos. But I would question I'm skeptical of tendencies to tag them as random or chaotic or probabilistic, so long as we do not completely understand them. Because I believe that as we gain understanding, the same thing is going to happen in quantum theory that happens everywhere else. It all turns out to be deterministic. We just have not gotten the pure understanding of quantum theory that would enable us to be able to say with perfect accuracy, yes, this is deterministic. That's just not where our technology is at this point in time. But all indication seems to be that everything upon gaining perfect understanding unfolds to be deterministic. So those are the main parts that I wanted to speak upon. And then lastly, he talks a little bit about morality and how our lack of free will affects morality. Now, the previous book about naturalism and determinism talked much more about morality. He gives it a very, very short section, which is fine. I really was more interested in the proofs and the explanations and the questions about it than the morality. But I do want to read what he has to say, because I think that my particular impression and to some degree the argument that I want to develop over the course of this of the oncoming episodes of this podcast are going to follow along more closely with this author's ideas than with the previous author that I already contested. So this author, Ahmad Safavy, he says, quote, "Some of the strongest oppositions to determinism and lack of free will have been based on the issues of moral responsibility and ethics. Arguments against a lack of free will, and thus against determinism itself, from the point of view of moralities, are plentiful. We may hear the opponents say, if we have no free will, and can act only according to the structure of our brains, then how are we supposed to deal with moral issues? Or, if we grant that humans have no power to make their decisions at will, would we not be issuing a free ticket to anarchy and destruction of humane values? How are we supposed to treat criminals? And if a murderer was supposed to kill, how could we punish him for his crime? Because the committer was deterministically set to commit that crime." My answer is this. How to answer those questions is our problem. Unfortunately, with all their ugliness and all the pain that they could cause, crimes are our problems, not nature's. Judicial laws by which we try the society's wrongdoers are man-made, and as such have no accommodation within the laws of nature. What we do, on the other hand, is a direct consequence of the law of nature, and therefore it should not come with surprise if no preventive measures against our personal and sociological problems are foreseen in it. Nature does not care if the loss of a dear friend makes me extremely sad. Nature works according to its structure, and that structure includes and encompasses everything, including us, our actions, and our decisions. And no, that structure does not always guarantee a happy ending for all events. Changing some of the outcomes of its structural features because of some painful consequences that may produce is not included in its mechanisms. If it were, we would never see an innocent little gazelle that feels fear and pain just as much as you and I do, running with its heart in its throat, and then ripped apart alive just because a pack of lions was hungry. Lions are biological machines. They consume energy, and when they run out of it, their brains tell them to eat. And when they get the signal, they go to work. No lion ever thinks, oh, I just couldn't bring myself to kill that innocent gazelle. How could I look into her mom's eyes next time I run into her on the plain? Lions kill when hungry because their structure tells them to. Or maybe you want a human-related example. How about this one? If nature were capable of feeling and understanding our problems, sufferings, and pains, Why, then, somebody would be born with a silver spoon in his mouth, well supported, and never having to worry about hunting for a job all his life, and another, just as human as the first one, is born into poverty, has to swallow his childhood dreams of nice toys and clothes, and just see them in his dreams, if he is not too hungry to fall asleep, and labors hard just to survive until he dies? Does nature care? And although it cannot be generalized across the populations, what are the possibilities of the first individual to become a wrongdoer as compared to the second one? As far as nature is concerned, if the conditions of the coming to this world for these two fellows are the way that they were just described, so be it, not nature's problem. In fact, nature does not and cannot feel the depths and the pains of any problems, simply because it is not capable of having a compassion, period. Nature just works according to the instructions that are encrypted in it. We could have had the right to ask those questions should every human being have been born and raised in exactly the same conditions and with access to exactly the same privileges. Although I still believe we couldn't, but just for the sake of argument. But it's not like that. Way too far from it. I shall not bore you with too long a discussion on this issue, but all you need to do is take another and deeper look around you. I'm sure you'll see what I'm talking about. And as for our human moral responsibilities, the only thing we could do is what we think is the best and right thing to do. We could punish wrongdoings, we could ignore them, or we could educate the wrongdoers if there is any rationale, time, justification, budget, and all other necessary means of giving such educations. We could ignore wrongdoings in our society, or we could try to cure the problems from their roots. We could be caring, sympathetic, and compassionate creatures and solve our social problems with care, empathy, kindness, and benevolence, or we could be just the opposite of these. Like everything else, whatever we do in this respect, too, is what we were supposed to do. They just happen to have the appearance of freely made decisions and free behaviors. Regardless, though, we will be pleased with them because it'll at least feel like we did a good deed because we chose to do so. But also, remember, the result of doing a good deed is good, no matter how we came about doing it. End quote. And so, my take on that last one is just that reality and nature unfold with pain and pleasure. And the pain and pleasure are structural components of humans. We feel pain and pleasure not because God gave us the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. We feel happiness and sadness and pain and pleasure and the emotions and the frustrations and the indignation and the appreciation and all the different things that we feel as a result of some sort of conditions of humanity or of reality, the way that we respond to them. Those are hardwired into our structure. So our capacity to want to right moral wrongs, our capacity to even feel morality or have a sense of morality, that's structural. That's molecular, if you will. It's a capacity and a function that's in us as a result of all of these processes that this book has been talking about. And so when we enact some sort of law or policy or what have you, we do so because we have a functional drive to want to do so. It's in us. And so if we choose to neglect these sorts of social problems, we would do so because it was in us. Whatever we do, whatever course we will take, is the course that we will take on account of our particular biologies and our particular experiences. Now, every person is not the same biologically. We don't have the same genetic code. We don't have the same dispositions. We weren't raised in the same environment. And so we don't all have the same exact moral sense. We don't all have the same objectives. The varieties of genetic mutation, the different influences of environment on our brains lead us all to believe slightly different things about the way things are and the way things should be. And that's okay. We're created that way. Nothing is off key. Everything is on key. And so We may say, and I think we should say, all right, well, a person may have been determined through a combination of nature and nurture to commit some horrible crime, and we are determined ourselves through nature and nurture to impose some sort of environmental restraints upon people, such as punishments that would serve as disincentives that would alter the environment of the criminal from committing the crime. Because incentives and disincentives actually work. They actually have positive results. That incentives encourage behavior and disincentives discourage behavior. They are environmental components of people. So that they're part of the deterministic drives that would lead somebody to do one thing or another. We don't just say, your biology and your experience cause you to do this thing, and so I throw my hands in the air. No, we say, I have the capacity to alter your environment. I have the capacity to create and eliminate incentives and disincentives that act as environmental guidelines to other people. And so I can manipulate other people's behavior in that way toward the ends that I am biologically and environmentally driven to seek out. And I talked about a little bit about this in the last time of the naturalistic book, and I think I'm going to start wrapping this up because I've gone on for quite some time. I believe that coming up soon we'll be talking further about evolution because, like I said, the whole point of diving into this naturalistic philosophy, or maybe not whole point, but a major purpose in having this conversation and reviewing this book is to provide the framework so that when we get into evolution, we understand the implications of evolution, so that we don't just use evolution as a club to beat over the head of creationists and to score some sort of political points or whatnot. We are going to look at the ramifications of evolution in a deterministic world and the political implications thereof. So I guess that's going to wrap it up. I encourage you to check out my Facebook page. You can follow my Twitter feed. You can find me on Patreon if you want to support the show, which I wholeheartedly, of course, encourage. And that's going to be it for today. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.